Before continuing with the installation of details on this section of the superstructure, I need to install the tripod legs. This is because the tripod legs require a bit of manhandling to get them in place, and then once they are in place, I need to add details to the legs themselves. That comes in the form of trunking. Installing trunking will require some filling and sanding. That can be a bit rough, so it's best to do that before I get too many details in this area. It is for this reason that in the previous video I left the upper air defense platform quite open. Although I am going to glue the tripod legs in place now, I'm not going to glue them to the deck for the Admiral's Bridge. This is because I want to be able to remove this section of superstructure. Being able to remove this section of superstructure will make it a lot easier to work on in the future. That being said, I do need to make sure that the legs are correctly positioned. So I do use the base of the superstructure to assist with positioning the legs, and then once they are in the correct position, I glue them in place using extra thin plastic cement. Now that the legs are correctly in position, I can work on creating the trunking. The guide for this model on the HMS Hood Association's website has been updated to include pictures of the trunking and some guides as to where it should go. Essentially, there are two lines of trunking that go up the rear legs of the tripod mast, and in a section of trunking at the level of the upper air defense platform that connects those two lines of trunking to each other. To create the trunking, I'm using strips of 0.5 by 0.25 millimeter styrene stock. I actually want each line of the trunking to be 1 millimeter wide, but because the tripod mast legs are curved, if I were to use a single piece of 1 millimeter styrene stock, then the edges would stick out quite far. So instead, I'm going to use two sections of 0.5 millimeter styrene stock glued together next to each other, and then I'll fill the gap between them. That will create a slightly more curved effect. To install the styrene stock, I initially tack it in place using Revell Contactor Professional. This is a mainly trial and error process that I find it's best to do systematically. I start with the sections at the top of the tripod leg where they are quite visible and there's a long line that needs to be positioned correctly. And then I work my way down, ensuring that the subsequent sections of trunking are properly aligned with the upper section. Once correctly positioned, I use 2mm extra thin plastic cement to bond it in place. For the inner section, I need to be sure that the trunking does not obscure this platform that is mounted near the top of the tripod mast. If it is wrapped too far around to the inside of the leg, then it will be obstructed by the platform and the platform won't fit nicely. So to be sure that the trunking will fit in properly with this platform, I temporarily placed the plastic platform in the location and then used that as the guide to help me position the inner line of trunking. As for the platform itself, when it comes to the installation, I won't be using this plastic platform. I'll be using a replacement photo etch part that came with the FlyHawk Super Detail Upgrade Kit. Once I have both the inboard and outboard trunking installed, I connect them together at the level of the ADP. The gap between the trunking is roughly 1.5 millimeters. I simply fill that gap with 1.5 millimeter styrene stock that I cut to length. Once the styrene stock is installed, I then paint the top of it with Mr. Surfacer 500 that has been heavily thinned. Since the surfacer is very thin, a single coat is not sufficient to fill the gaps between the trunking. And at the level of the upper ADP, this is definitely too thin to fill those gaps. So I thinned out 2mm plastic putty and painted that on that connecting strip. After doing all of that, I now have one leg fully trunked and I'm happy with the effect that I've created. So I now need to make a mirror copy of it on the starboard leg. I followed the exact same process as before, doing my best to keep that mirror image. After applying surfacer and putty to fill the gaps and then giving it some time to dry, I can then file off the excess. I carefully file off the excess using a bar file, and then finish off the surface using 500 grit sandpaper. The finished surface can now be painted. I start by brush painting the lower portion of the legs with XF53, the color that I'm using for HMS Hood's superstructure. And then I mask off the upper section of the legs and spray them in XF1, black. After spraying the upper section of the legs in XF1, I realized that there really isn't much point in me bothering to mask off this area to spray paint and black paint. Black paint in an area of the ship like this, painted on with a brush, is going to be indistinguishable from airbrushed paint. The only difference is that if I paint with the airbrush, I have to mask off this area of the ship to ensure that I don't overspray, whereas with the paintbrush, I don't have to worry about that. So on the other side of the tripod legs, I paint them with a brush. Once I've done that, all the masking tape can be removed, and the installation of the tripod masts and their trunking is complete. And I think quite successful. In the next video, I'll install the hand railings that go between the rear tripod legs, and I'll install the voice pipes on the exterior of the forward air defense platform. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.